Hello, this is a sermon for the 19th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Year C. It will be the 7th of August 2022. The sermon is based on the following readings: Isaiah chapter 1, verse 1 and verses 10 to 20, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 to 3 and 8 to 16, and Luke's Gospel chapter 12, verses 32 to 46. Churchill once said of his famous Labour opponent Clement Attlee, "He's a modest man, with much to be modest about," and described him as a sheep in sheep's clothing. And again regaled his listeners with, "One day an empty taxi arrived at 10 Downing Street, and when the door was opened, Attlee got out." You can have a good laugh with Winston by searching for his famous insults and put-downs on the internet, but I suspect they wouldn't be so funny if you were the target. Isaiah must have been from the same mould. He started his prophetic career by comparing Jerusalem with Sodom and Gomorrah. What an insult to the citizenry of God's holy city. It then piles on the agony by denouncing their sacrifices in the temple as meaningless offerings, detestable to God, who hates their festivals and turns his back on their prayers. Isaiah lacks the Churchillian humour, but he has all the venom. He demands they reform their ways, seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the orphan and the widow. Faith and religious observance mean nothing unless they affect the way in which we live our lives. Religion must influence the everyday choices we make and how we treat others. This message is as old as the hills, yet forever new. The lectionary from which most mainline churches preach has the advantage of making preachers tackle passages and subjects they might otherwise shun. But since the lectionary often works its way steadily through a biblical source, it can get repetitive because gospel writers group stories together thematically. Today, we are revisiting the situation which we examined over the previous 3 weeks. Whereas Amos and Hosea were talking about the northern kingdom of Israel, today Isaiah is addressing the same issues in the southern kingdom of Judah. In Judah, his target is not just society, which has become obsessed with making money at the price of social justice, but Isaiah also criticises the religious hierarchy for carrying on as if nothing was happening. When the world's problems seem so huge, it is very tempting for the church or synagogue or whatever to turn its back in helplessness and put its head in the ecclesiastical sand. If it's a choice between solving world poverty and deciding how many angels can dance on the end of a pin, you can appreciate why the angel debate sometimes wins out. Yet there is hope. A promise of transformation interrupts Isaiah's invective. Their sins, which are as scarlet as blood, will be washed as white as snow. But this comes with a challenge. Choose which it shall be. Obey, and you will prosper and eat the best of the land. Rebel, and you'll be the ones that are eaten by the sword. Judah, a tiny city-state, sandwiched between Assyria to the north, Egypt to the south, and the embryonic power of Babylon to the east, represented a tasty morsel to more than one giant neighbour. So, however tempting it is to opt out of a world in turmoil and find refuge in a cosy religious safety blanket, speaking to a world in turmoil should be the very essence of faith. Faith is not just about saying your prayers, but also about how you do business, or care for the weak and vulnerable. Faith underpins the whole of society. Faith is far too important to be discounted as nothing more than a private affair, and the church no more than a hobby. Nations fall or rise according to what they believe. Building concentration camps for Jews, or throwing gay people off tall buildings, or sending people to the Gulag for not agreeing with a glorious leader, are all possible because some people believe that that sort of stuff is right. Those who would wish to speak truth to power in such regimes often have no freedom to do so. The church will lose its voice too if we fail to use it for long enough. Most cars can run for quite a while when the fuel gauge reaches empty, but there comes a time when an engine cannot run on fumes alone. What people believe is a foundation on which societies are built. When those beliefs have been lost through war, political turmoil, or materialistic decadence, those societies have usually crumbled too. One of the public roles of the church is to speak truth to power. Since the pandemic, especially, there is a growing authoritarian streak evident in many Western countries, not just in the usual culprits. Even in the much hailed innocence and peacefulness of New Zealand society, there is a growing wave of violence, crime, and simmering, unfocused anger. Peace, democracy, and human rights do not fall from the trees. They have been attained through struggle and sacrifice, because people were prepared to suffer for the sake of them, because they believed they were following a good and noble cause. They had a vision of a better world, inspired by the values of what they believed. So don't tell me faith doesn't matter. Isaiah, like Amos and Hosea before him, says that when a society turns away from its founding principles, there will be a day of reckoning to come. The passage from Luke today suggests Christians can offer a different voice in the discussion because of their perspective. The world is a hostile place for the gospel. We could turn our back and effectively sleep through the world's agonies, or we could bring a word of both realism and hope to the situation. The realism we bring is the acknowledgement that all political panaceas are doomed to fail, that every solution will need constant review, because perfection lies beyond us. Sin opposes God's will in every human heart. Hence the pleas we hear in Luke chapter 12 to always be ready to give an account to God for your life. The belief that we will answer for our failures should be good news, because it should prick the conscience of those in power to deal wisely and justly in the world. For this reason, I have expanded the lectionary reading in Luke to include verses 41 to 46, because they show where these words of Jesus are heading. These verses speak of the steward who takes advantage of the delay in the master's arrival to cheat and abuse the servants and steal their provisions, which the master has left in his care for them. People in power heed the warning. People are fooling themselves if they do fall prey to amassing great wealth for themselves, especially when done at the expense of others, because worldly wealth is not the same as true wealth. The injunction not to trust in earthly wealth, but in heavenly treasure, where thief and moth cannot enter, is found in similar form in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. The reference to keeping your lamp burning in readiness recalls the parable of the wise and foolish virgins in Matthew chapter 25. Do not fall asleep and drift unknowingly into worldly ways. It takes effort and constant attention to live with heaven's value system when the world all around you is living by other values. The Christian can unwittingly join the crowd before he realizes. Staying awake through the night is hard. It is a fight. It is exhausting. But it is the image Jesus uses for the life of the church. Yet for those who do stay awake and in readiness, great reward awaits. The Master himself will come and reward their faithful service. The servants will become the honoured guests. Those who have been doing the serving will be the ones who receive service. Now, does Jesus really suggest we guard against worldliness by selling all our worldly possessions? Matthew does not include selling all possessions in his version of this teaching in Matthew 6:19 to 24. But Luke includes a call to sell all your possessions and give it all away to the poor. This is typical rabbinic language. The use of hyperbole for the purposes of making teaching memorable is at play here. Like those verses which tell us to chop off our hand or pluck out our eye if they cause us to sin. Selling off all one's possessions has never been applied to all Christian believers, although it has always been a free choice for those very few who felt it would assist their faith journey by following the life of the monastery or hermit. Jerusalem's pooling of resources in Acts chapter 5 prefigures later monastic life to a degree, but it was never a universal expectation. It may have been just what some needed to do, such as the rich young ruler in Luke chapter 18, or others chose to do, like St. Francis of Assisi. But the life of self-imposed poverty was never extended as a mandate for belonging to the church. So much for the realism of the gospel message. The letter to the Hebrews gives us the hope. When you feel overwhelmed by the world's problems, when you've lived long enough to see the same old problems come round again, like on an economic carousel, when you know the same responses will get the same results as last time, when sin always seems to have the final say, then hope in God gives us the perspective to carry on. Hebrews commends the patriarchs who show us how to live in this world, which will never deliver paradise on earth. Abraham not only left his home for a new land, even though he did not know where he was going. It continues, he lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. They were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Hebrews 11, verses 9, 10 and 16. The image of living in tents is a suitable image for the Christian condition. We are always going to be disappointed with life on earth to a degree, because we believe that sin will always conspire against us. But rather than sink into the abyss of cynical hopelessness, paradise remains our ultimate goal. Jesus Christ is the one true foundation on which paradise can be built. All the church can do, in her own imperfect way, is to aspire to live according to the heavenly vision. The church cannot build heaven here upon earth, only point towards it. Those Christian communities that claim to have perfected heaven upon earth quickly turn into a living hell. The patriarchs did not see returning to their old country as a solution. They preferred to live in tents, for after they had received the vision of what was to come, they could never be satisfied again with what they had left behind. Likewise, we acknowledge that the world is a mess in so many ways, despite so many good and decent people sacrificing so much to make it better. We acknowledge the church is a feeble mess, despite so many inspiring men and women of faith who have done so much to proclaim the values of the kingdom. Yet we do not turn our back in despair. We continue to speak truth to power and live in hope of a better tomorrow. Why? Because we trust in God who created all things from naught and who has prepared a paradise in heaven that cannot be destroyed by our failures on earth. No matter how many times we fall on our faces, our loving God will put us back on our feet to try again. Amen.